Angeles River, Santa Clara River, Dominguez Channel, and Coyote Creek over 1,000 times between 2003 to 2011, which is quite staggering. So as you know, it is the mandate of this board to ensure that beneficial uses are protected. And to give an example of one such beneficial use, we have water contact recreation with the goal of protecting public health. So as you can see by this chart, Heal the Bay's Beach Report Card program has tracked over 4,500 instances of bacteria TMDL exceedances. So in other words, since 2006, public health has been frequently at risk, and public health concerns are definitely present in our region. And here is the statewide map of 303D impairment. So obviously it's not just a Region 4 issue that we're talking about here. These problems extend statewide. So often we hear about the costs of compliance, and the claim costs have been talked about a lot by the previous presenters. But I think it's important to, again, set the stage with the other costs that are at play here with this permit. So you are well aware of the public health costs that are associated with polluted beaches. Swimming in polluted beaches in LA County cause between 427,000 and 990,000 cases of GI every year. And this equates to large public health costs. You know, it's upwards of $278 million depending on which model you use. Also, we have our ocean economy here in California, which is very valuable, with California having the largest ocean economy in the U.S., ranking #1 overall for both employment and gross state product. And local beachgoers in California spend money when they come to the beaches and use this valuable resource, as much as $9.5 billion annually, and the non-market values associated with beach going in California may be as high as $5.8 billion annually. So this is important to keep in mind in this discussion. Also, with beach closures, we have found that stormwater runoff in LA County coastal waters caused or contributed to potentially thousands of days of beach closures or advisories in 2012. In fact, LA County reported 1,768 total closure or advisory days in 2012 from all sources, and this is likely underreported. It's found that an increase in water quality in Long Beach from just a C grade to a B grade could create $8.8 million in economic benefits over a 10-year period. So the economic story is definitely two-sided in this discussion. But there is good news. There are opportunities to change this paradigm and to keep our coastal economy strong. We've seen success stories in LA, and there are many more that can be realized. So with that, I turn it over to Liz to talk about some of the concerns and hopefully some solutions.
Good afternoon, Liz Crossan from Los Angeles Waterkeeper. I'm going to briefly go through some of the legal requirements for NPDES permits and MS4 in particular under the Clean Water Act, not because I know that you're all well aware of that, but just to sort of set the foundation for some of our concerns and to also really emphasize the fact that these are those same requirements that are the basis for provisions that have been upheld numerous times in state and federal court related to this permit. And just to emphasize that the Clean Water Act has been described as strong medicine for a good reason, and that's because it is incredibly important to LA specifically, as you've just heard, that we address water quality issues that impact not only public health and our communities, but also our ecological systems. So first, of course, water quality standards are established to protect the beneficial uses, and those are established for each of our water bodies in Los Angeles, and the state must adopt those, and they must be implemented and require compliance through our NPDES permits. And where water quality standards are not being met, those water bodies are deemed impaired. And for impaired water bodies, the state must establish TMDLs, those limits that establish how much of a certain pollutant can reach a certain water body without further impairing, and also with the idea that our main goal is to restore these water bodies so eventually they do meet water quality standards. And federal regulations require that our NPDES permits implement those waste load allocations developed in TMDLs in a consistent manner. a manner that is consistent with what has been established under a TMDL, which is something that is at issue under this 2012 permit. And according to EPA, where the TMDL includes waste load allocations for stormwater sources that provide numeric pollutant loads, that where feasible, the state should also apply numerics. And where feasible has been defined not as feasibility as in terms of compliance, but feasibility in terms of setting standards, setting limits. So the receiving water limitations under the 2001 permit are up on the screen, Part 2.1, that discharges from the MS4 that cause or contribute to a violation of standards are prohibited. And these provisions are consistent with the State Board Order 9905, which modified an earlier order and made clear that safe harbors, according to EPA and at the time the State Board, were no longer an available option for the regional boards to implement through these permits. And like all NPDES permits, MS4 permits must ensure that discharges do not cause or contribute to violations of water quality standards. And in particular, Section 402P requires that permittees reduce pollution to MEP, to the maximum extent practicable, and that the regulators do have the discretion to impose requirements it deems appropriate for the control of those pollutants. Again, this language has been upheld in a previous challenge to this permit in state court. It was most recently upheld by the Ninth Circuit and recognized as being without a safe harbor, and is the means that permittees must, under the 2001 permit, comply with water quality standards. So I'd like to talk about the 2012 permit and actually what we support, what we like, because there are things in it that are very positive, and they have been mentioned by some other permittees, but in particular, the long overdue incorporation of TMDLs is imperative to the proper execution of this permit and what is required under the Clean Water Act. In addition, there are LID provisions that you've heard about that will increase our ability to address runoff in developed regions, that will allow us to control pollution at the source, which is something that we often talk about and is very important to our work. You've heard about the LID ordinances and Green Street provisions that are in the new LAMS4 permit. And we also believe that the watershed-based engineering solutions that are discussed in this permit could provide a real opportunity for progress and really have the potential to result in multiple benefits. So yes, our main objective here is to address water quality standards, but at the same time we recognize that there's this vast array of other benefits that we may receive from the imposition of these types of solutions. So things like greening our communities and water supply implications, all of these things are things that we might achieve under a really well-developed engineered solution, and we have a proposed solution that we think could get us there. We also support the fact that this permit encourages collaboration among permittees. You've heard that many of the permittees have come together. That is a very positive thing, and I think the only thing that could really get us to a watershed-based approach to addressing violations of water quality standards. And it also really helps us to maximize how we can address projects on a regional basis and really look at big regional projects as opposed to just piecemeal tiny projects. And lastly, the monitoring program in this permit requires both outfall and receiving water monitoring, which we believe does help with clarity both for the regulators, the citizens, and also the permittees, and will really help with source identification. So then we have some issues with the 2012 permit, and these are the provisions that we believe that are illegal under the 2012 permit. First and foremost, we believe that the WIMP approach is a recipe for continued delay and is illegal, not because of the reasons that I just stated, the good parts of those programs, but because there are safe harbors where none previously existed. And in concept, as I mentioned, a program like an EWIMP might be a pathway towards compliance, an engineered solution, but the problem with this permit is that there is no evidence that shows that the process that's been put forth will actually achieve water quality standards in fact. It has been stated that the goal is to achieve water quality standards, receiving water limitations under TMDLs, but in fact, we do not believe that we will see that under this permit. And regardless of what we believe, the evidence is not in the record to determine whether or not that's the case.
Can you just help me understand that? What evidence would be what evidence would be adequate
Well,
at this point?
we will propose our alternative pathway that we think could actually achieve that, and that would include a peer-reviewed model and a process that would actually ensure that what was being implemented would achieve water quality standards. But it also requires that at the end of the day there is monitoring that actually shows that those interim and final limits will be met. And that's really the piece that's missing here, is we don't have that assurance, that real assurance that in fact the receiving water limitations will be met at the end of the day. And further, we believe that the provisions in this permit violate the anti-backsliding requirements under the Clean Water Act, and that rather than maintaining the 2001 permit's clear prohibition against violating water quality standards, this permit actually exempts compliance. And yes, the receiving water limitation language is still in the permit as stated by the regional board, but in other parts of the permit, which I'll show you in a minute, there are these provisions that excuse compliance as long as you are under a WIMP or EWIMP. I will just also mention that it was stated that the anti-backsliding requirements do not apply because this is not an effluent limitation. However, the requirement in the permit is on discharges that cause or contribute exceedances of water quality standards. It's necessarily a limitation on discharges and therefore is an effluent limitation. Even if it wasn't, federal regulations also prohibit backsliding when it comes to standards or conditions on permits, which also applies in this case. And none of the exceptions under the anti-backsliding provisions apply as well. And we've gone through all of this in our briefs and to you, and of course I'll answer any questions. In addition, it violates the anti-degradation requirements that require that existing water quality in water bodies be maintained to support existing and designated uses. In no case may water quality be degraded to the extent that those are jeopardized. And any regional board action that would result in the degrading of water quality is required to go through an anti-degradation analysis, which in this case they have not completed. And lastly, I know that this specific hearing is related to receiving water limitations, but the permit also violates interim and final waste load allocations that are set out in TMDLs. So specifically, the illegal safe harbors in the permit are in these two provisions. There's actually 6 provisions that we're requesting that you remove. These two address the forgiveness of violations of the receiving water limitations when a permittee is either in the process of developing or has developed an WIMP or an EWIMP. So both of those are safe harbors of the receiving water limitations. These two provisions that are up on the screen are in relation to the receiving water limitations. There is a similar provision that in relation to the interim limits for TMDLs. And these provisions are in relation to, in the TMDL section in the back of the permit, there are provisions that excuse compliance with interim WQBLs as well as final TMDL limits where you are under an enhanced watershed management plan and addressing runoff equivalent to the 85th percentile. And again, the evidence is not in the record that shows that that engineered solution will actually achieve those final TMDL limits. So the minimum legal requirements for this permit are that these safe harbor provisions be removed. This is the first step of what we're asking, is that you make this permit a legal permit and that you allow us to move forward to address the water quality problems that we have in Los Angeles. We do also, in addition to eliminating these illegal provisions, we do have a alternative pathway that we would like to propose to you that Daniel Cooper is going to speak about now.
That's a great picture.
I'm Daniel Cooper with Lawyers for Clean Water, and I make a habit of representing the keepers up and down California, so I've seen many of you before. I participated in the enforcement action against LA County and the City of Malibu, and in the settlement negotiations or discussions with the regional board and the other stakeholders, as they were characterized, on the permit. And so we spent a lot of time looking at the enhanced watershed management plans or programs, and try to come up with a way to allow for what the board characterizes as alternative compliance determinations, some alternative means of getting to water quality standards, making real progress, giving the dischargers time to implement engineered solutions, provide some certainty to them in order to do that, while still complying with the Act and not giving up on the basic requirement that ultimate compliance is determined in the water, where people go, where the fish are, what we're supposed to be dealing with here. And through that process, we came up with what we'll call a legal engineered solution or legal program. So the general principles of this program would be, first, to require a demonstration of compliance, and that the compliance program, the package that would achieve compliance, infiltration, packages of BMPs, LID, whatever the blend is for a particular sub-watershed, would be developed using peer-reviewed modeling. 2 or 3 were discussed that are already sort of approved by regulatory agencies, are readily available to the public, are scientifically defensible. That would be used to develop the mix of measures and would demonstrate that they actually will achieve the applicable waste load allocations in the timeline set out in the TMDLs, the water quality standards, the other limits set forth and required under the permit. The second piece would be public input. A problem with modeling and modeled solutions is often their black box approaches, and it's hard for the public to get in and participate. So that's an important piece of this, is that it would be subject to public comment and review, and would, where appropriate, go before the regional board itself for hearing, comment, and approval pursuant to the Clean Water Act process. The third primary element would be an enforceable schedule for implementation. And that would include interim limits and requirements, and those interim limits and requirements would be consistent with the interim deadlines, final deadlines, and so on in the existing TMDLs, which is a basic requirement of the Clean Water Act. The deadlines set out in the watershed management plans cannot be inconsistent with TMDLs, which are required by the Clean Water Act to be incorporated into the permit, into the NPDES permit. And then the critical piece from our perspective is that dischargers are not automatically deemed in compliance. This Orwellian shall be deemed in compliance language we've seen in section after section of the draft LA permit or the final LA permit. Instead, if there needs to be time for implementation of these programs, they're put forward through enforcement orders, discretionary enforcement orders issued by the regional board, cease and desist orders, time schedule orders, other enforcement orders, not in the permit itself, which would be illegal and inconsistent with the Act, and would block other entities like EPA or citizens from enforcing the permit terms where they feel that the regional boards are not acting in a timely manner, like 12 years of delay we've experienced to date under the existing permit. So those are the critical pieces of a legal and enforceable program. Then there needs to also be end-of-pipe monitoring, as the permit now proposes, as well as receiving water monitoring to evaluate how the modeling went. Is it accurate? Is it working? Is the program actually achieving compliance with the interim and final waste load allocations and water quality standard limits that the Clean Water Act requires? Are we achieving restoration of beneficial uses? And to calibrate the model, calibrate the program as the permit process goes forward. And lastly, and this is critical, ultimate compliance is determined in the receiving water and at the end of the pipe. Not just compliance with a model, but actually where people are in the water, where the fish are. So 2 examples, whoops. These are 2 sort of plucked out to really make the point. Where TMDLs have been adopted, there has to be a demonstration that the proposed engineering pollution control program will achieve compliance with the waste load allocations. And again, to emphasize what's wrong with the enhanced watershed management plan that was approved under or at least the concept under the LA permit, is that there was an assumption that an 85th percentile rain event design standard for infiltration basins would achieve the waste load allocations. There is nothing in the record to demonstrate that that's true. The modeling is not in the record. Now, if it can be done, who knows if 85th percentile is the right number? There can be a design standard for those infiltration basins. I mean, that's the way forward. But it has to be based on the modeling and actually demonstrated and in the record with public review so that everyone knows it's going to work And then it has to be monitored over time to make sure if we got it wrong, it gets adjusted. So it does work. And again, the time for implementation, we agree that the dischargers deserve time to implement that program. They deserve some certainty about if they implement that engineered program, which they've demonstrated through a good model is going to achieve compliance with the wastewater allocations and the water quality standards, that the regional board will not be enforcing against them during that time period. But the place to put that, consistent with the Clean Water Act, is in enforcement orders from the regional board, not in the permit itself, not in sort of a safe harbor deemed in compliance, like what we had in the permit here, or even compliance schedules would be illegal because they'd be inconsistent with the TMDL interim deadlines and the final sunsetting and a bunch of other legal requirements. So the board can do what it wants in terms of enforcement, and that will provide some level of shielding to the dischargers and certainty to allow them to implement their program, but then it would be consistent with the Act. And where TMDLs haven't been adopted, similarly, the engineered solution and the modeling would need to demonstrate that water quality standards would be complied with. And given the fact that the Clean Water Act sets out that permits can only live 5 years, even though we all know regional boards often don't get around to reissuing on that timeline, they would need to comply with the water quality standards during the 5-year life of the permit and make that demonstration in year 5. And again, time for implementation would be through enforcement orders, not a compliance schedule within the permit. So the negotiation with LA Regional Board was very interesting. It raised a lot of hopes. I feel like LA County came to the table very serious with a real serious proposal. But I feel that the deal that was cut, I don't know this, but it seems to me the deal that was cut was providing shielding, safe harbors, and deemed in compliance language in exchange for some progress on implementation of watershed-based programs. And that is a Hobbesian bargain if ever I've heard of one. You have to come up close to they have to be, you cannot provide, under the Clean Water Act, the regional board and this permit simply cannot provide shielding from Clean Water Act requirements in exchange for some engineering progress. And that is what is proposed here. And, but on the other hand, this engineered solution, this engineered proposal, this watershed-based modeling approach is the way forward. It provides potentially tremendous benefits, and there is a way to do it in a way that complies with the Act. It's relatively straightforward changes to the permit terms would get us to that place. And so I hope that you all consider making those changes. And, you know, these changes, while permits are somewhat site-specific, would be applicable in MS4 permits across the state. So, thank you.
So just to bring this around full circle, I think, this permit and the board's deliberation here and over the coming months over the permit as a whole really does mark an opportunity to completely change the way that we're looking at stormwater throughout California. The LA permit provided a framework in terms of shifting to that watershed-based approach where we can look at things holistically across large areas, look at partnering among different cities, the boards, potentially water supply agencies and other partners we never would have thought of looking to before. And there is tremendous opportunity to do that. The problem is that this permit does so at the expense of ensuring that we are going to clean up our waters. And we think that the board, as Daniel pointed out, with minimal changes, but very important changes, can fix that issue and can really move us forward towards meeting water quality standards, towards changing our urban landscapes, and towards really protecting our waters throughout California. And we hope that you will take our proposal seriously and implement that as the solution towards fixing the LA permit problems. We're happy to answer any questions.
Right, thank you. I have a couple, but let me turn to my colleagues first.
I'll start. Thank you for the presentation, and thank you for putting some thought into a constructive path forward from your perspective. You know, I thought it was there was some compelling things to think about. And I guess, you know, I would just encourage a conversation here in terms of, you know, we heard from the folks that are dealing with all the constraints, and I think, you know, it was articulated pretty well that there's in the current status of governance, cities would be faced with internalizing costs with which would be, the benefits would be a lot of externalized benefits, you know, say for, the water replenishment district that gets the benefits of the infiltration, but the cities pay for the engineering and the planning and the construction. And you laid out sort of a two-step point, you know, there's the issue of the planning time for conducting the engineering analysis and reasonable assurance analysis. And then there's the construction time. And, you know, I hear you in terms of your legal interpretations that are, that I understand. Is there some room here, you know, to work within that framework, you know, the planning versus when the public process has shown some reasonable assurance and collaboration with environmental interests to, you know, to find a way to create a path to compliance short of an enforcement approach, you know, once we're building things.
Well, I think that's what our proposed alternative compliance pathway really provides, is it does provide this alternative way for the regional board to give permittees time under these enforcement orders to develop their plans to come into compliance, to reach those limits at the end of the day. And that's what we are trying to propose and create.
And to that end, just specifically on the portion discussing that sort of design phase where permittees are designing their program, EPA raised this as an issue as well, as a concern in their letter, and they raised it at the San Diego hearing as well, and I believe at the LA permit hearing is another forum, that there is a real concern with that interim period where there's no actual plan on the table. There's no specific program that's going to be adopted that has been vetted in any way, shape, or form, but the way the permit is given now, it would give permittees immunity just because they said, hey, we're going to adopt this and let's see what happens over the next couple of years.
Well, for 12 or 18 months, right? And
Or
possibly
actually,
longer.
it's longer in the case of the EWIM programs. I
EWIM.
believe it's 30 months or longer. And that's a significant concern. And one of the problems that the Clean Water Act does not allow for, EPA has raised significant concern over it. And the approach we're taking, where we're trying to provide some certainty for the permittees that, you know, as they go forward with this process, it's not completely in vain, while balancing that against the need to ensure that waters are protected and that the mandates of the Clean Water Act are actually met. Mm-hmm. So taking that potential sort of shielding, as Daniel puts it, out of the permit and placing it in the hands of the regional board to issue varying orders that may achieve a similar result, but still allow for enforcement to be made. EPA is a good example, or other parties to enforce where things really are not being done properly, as opposed to a blanket, complete and utter protection from any kind of enforcement, even if the plans aren't being crafted properly or deadlines aren't being made properly, really does sort of, we think, address this issue.
Mm-hmm. And I think you should also know that we do have a representative on the Technical Advisory Committee that's looking at these plans coming in. We're participating in that process as well. And so when you say, I think when you asked about something other than the enforcement route, we are hopeful. We've been locked in battle with LA County for years. That's not feasible for us or for you to do, for every municipality statewide. So we're hoping that this alternative, a legal alternative means with a backstop that's ultimate compliance, is the way forward. We're very hopeful it will be, and we're engaged in that process. We're just very, very concerned about this shielding concept.
Do you mind if I, just to understand the argument, it's something you said, no, it's something you said earlier, Daniel, is the issue, I want to get back to incentives in a minute, wearing two hats, and obviously we'll spend a lot of time on briefing on the legal issues and work with counsel before we get to those decisions. But right now I'm just trying to understand, are you saying that the permit itself gives too much discretion to the staff to say something's okay and then shields, whereas if you had it under a CDO or some other compliance order, there'd be really specified steps that then other people could engage on if a given, like, let's just assume everybody at the regional board right now is terrific, the board is terrific, it's all, you're in total lockstep like mine, but the life of this permit is longer. Are you worried that someone will say okay to something that's just not strong enough or not decided in the light of day? Is that what the argument you're
one
making?
Problem. I think another problem is, and we view this as with the number of cities involved and the varying levels of engagement and sophistication. With a real problem is that the applications come in and they're inadequate. Staff reviews them, sends them back. They come back again, they're inadequate. Staff reviews them, they go back, they come back again,
really
they're
long
inadequate.
loop.
And there's no end to that process ultimately, and there's no way for citizens or EPA to intervene and stop that do loop.
Okay.
And we're very concerned. The staff has assured us, we're going to dedicate adequate resources to this. Okay, but trust and verify. So we're worried about that. I'd also like to speak to Ms. Spivey-Weber's question about water supply, and we thought about that quite a bit too. We don't have a solution, but I will say that California, in my experience, is unique in having water supply and water quality in the same agency, you guys. And that this MS4 permits provides a unique opportunity to think about, I know this is, various entities talk about this, but one water. And that's LA is a unique place to be able to do that. Water supply, stormwater infiltration, water quality, water supply. The loop goes together. And, the municipalities have described the problem in governance of coming up with a way to monetize that. And that's true. But, if there's an adjudication, that's a potential place to do something about that. There is a regulatory structure for you all to make that work. And I don't have a solution for you here, but there is one. And that's where California and really the United States needs to go to get their hands on making stormwater a water supply source and a commodity, a valuable resource instead of pollution to be cleaned up and disposed of. So I'm hopeful that through this process, something like that can pop out.
And we really do, sort of addressing Mr. Moore's point, about costs and sort of those benefit for other agencies. That's undeniably true. But this type of approach that we're advocating also opens the door to an opportunity to engage with those agencies, to say we have multiple different paths that we can use in order to achieve this retention goal. Why don't we partner with you and we can build an actual infiltration facility, and somebody, we'll allocate the water. We'll sort out what the water rates are in that case. But we now have two agencies that are putting money towards what originally would have just been a water quality approach. Same thing with parks agencies or air quality agencies. There are any number of other partners that can be engaged with here who could all join together in forming these regional type solutions. And we really see this approach we're taking as an opportunity to engage those agencies and to try and advocate for those solutions.
So I'm trying to figure, in thinking about it, obviously we want to incentivize that multi-benefit, multi-agency approach. That's where it's not even the whole being greater. Well, it is the whole being greater in the sum of the parts, but as we think about those scarce local dollars that people were talking about being spent to remedy multiple local ills, also in a way that community members can see. I mean, it's nicer to have a park or a river restoration or something that achieves multiple benefits, and that makes it a lot easier for local officials to raise the money to do this stuff, so you have kind of a virtuous circle if you do that. And what I'm hearing you say is different than what I thought I read when I looked at the slides in advance, so it's helpful, which is that you're talking in part about the mechanism you think should be used, not that everything has to be done in 5 years. Because clearly part of the trade-off is it's going to take longer to do those kind of projects. And the trade-off is, in order to get that bigger prize that we want, rather than people feeling they've got to do individual treatment plants all over the place, which somebody said was infeasible, but it's not infeasible, it's just expensive, right? Except in a big storm. And our preference is to not do that, because people don't want to be in violation. So the question is, how do you find a vehicle that has people doing a lot of stuff, actually doing stuff that's going to result in water quality benefits, but also these multiple benefits, and create the incentive as well as the assurance that something happens. And you're just saying, you want a different mechanism on the one hand, and on the other that you want more evidence or proof to support whatever the decision's going to be in a given case. And so if you, what you'd be suggesting we look at here, I'm just trying to understand, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, I'm just trying to understand it, is more concrete requirements about what's going to happen that are cued to water quality, right? Or just even more concrete action steps, and then tied down in some transparent, enforceable way that doesn't become a black box that...
Well, and that the requirements, the interim and final requirements that are tied directly to TMDLs, waste load allocations, and water quality standards. The process that's already gone past, already been developed to protect water quality, to protect beneficial uses, now needs to be implemented through this modeling process and then stuff on the ground. And we're concerned about this safe harbor shielding business that's going on in there. We're concerned about the process taking long and perhaps getting locked into a do loop with staff, or, you know, because they have resource constraints, and this is a very resource intensive process they're proposing. Want to make sure the public's involved in there, but it has to be linked to the Clean Water Act's requirements. I mean, that's how you make it legal, and also how in our view we make real progress. I mean, all that science has been done, setting up the TMDLs, you know, build on that. Don't create a new timetable with new deadlines and just blow off demon compliance, the TMDL waste load allocations and the water quality standards that have been developed. So you're right, there are some problems with the 5-year cycle and the 5-year cycle of the permit in terms of getting there by then, but the vast majority of the TMDLs for the rivers in LA go longer than that. There are some interim deadlines that have already passed, but most of them provide plenty of time to implement this kind of a program. And so this permit you don't have to create these shields to
create the incentive to be able to go?
Exactly. In fact, in our view, it's the reverse. If you take away the hammer, then, I mean, as demonstrated for the last 12 years when there was almost no enforcement except for a couple cases, nobody made any real progress. Nobody engaged in the iterative process. Nobody admitted they were violating water quality standards or contributing to
that there's
And so the demonstration that's in this first bullet, you're referring to that and not to specific demonstration in each water management plan that the plan will result in achieving the receiving water limits. You're talking about the model on the 5th percentile that the Regional Water Board used to set up this alternative compliance pathway.
It's actually a problem in both settings, I would say, that the model, and I apologize for making your life more complicated, but it is a problem in both settings. One, the actual model was not in the record for review, so we were never able to look at it and say, oh, actually, we agree that the way this model processes, the inputs that are given into it, the data it goes through, and the output actually we agree with this model that it will demonstrate that compliance can be achieved or will be achieved. The second part is during the development of these plans, the model would need to be run for each watershed or watershed group to then show that the plan they are going to put in place will meet the water quality standards.
So that led to my question, are there any examples out there of good plans that have the models and the data to demonstrate this future compliance?
I think there's, this is definitely very cutting edge, and there's models. Heal the Bay worked with the County of LA, the City of LA, and Geosyntec Consultants on a model probably 5 or 6 years ago now, one that's being considered for, pursuing these watershed management plans and enhanced watershed management plans now. And so different efforts have been run. For example, the Bayona Creek TMDLs, the City of LA has gone out and used that model and trying to figure out where to site BMPs most efficiently and cost effectively to reduce the maximum loadings. But I think through this process, we realized that we need more discussion on what are the appropriate inputs, what are the appropriate assumptions. That was just one city's effort to start the planning process, but I don't think we've really taken it to the next level to look at, what is the variety of, keep in mind this is going to be both infiltration BMPs and other types of BMPs.
Right.
The EWIMPs aren't going to be feasible everywhere in the county. So it's going to be this combination, and we need to make the right assumptions. And so, all of us are participating in this TAC process, which is a complicated, complex process. And so we're trying to figure out how to use those existing models and use them appropriately in this case and see where those assumptions are. And maybe there needs to be some sort of margin of safety because a model is never perfect. So I think there's some good starts to answer your question, but I am not familiar with any, great examples of the perfect plan that are out there.
Can I ask a question? And no, you may know the answer to this, or somebody else out there may, but when EPA approved the consent decree on the CSO issue in Philadelphia, where Philadelphia is allowed to be doing this major retrofit as opposed to building massive treatment. Again, not stormwater, it's CSOs. What kind of model did they use? Did they make a showing that this would be equivalent, or did EPA just decide this was good enough to accept because it would make a lot of progress and do good for the city?
Unfortunately, I am not the person who knows. I'm hoping someone else in the room would have that answer available, but I would be more than happy to get back to board council or board staff with an
Yeah, or
answer to that.
maybe I can task
Is APA?
somebody at the regional board, I'm at the state board, and figuring it out and talking to EPA.
Also, it's worth
Because
noting-
it would have been a similar kind of an assessment when they were deciding to take that as a consent decree, right? I'm just thinking it's the biggest analogous thing I can think of.
And there are a number of other cities that, particularly with CSOs, have looked at different means of assuring compliance and are particularly turning more and more to these green infrastructure and watershed-based
Right.
approaches.
Have you looked at the Washington DC example that was referenced, but we haven't seen the details on it yet?
The permit approach there?
Mm-hmm.
There are some similarities. There are also some key differences in that permit. It's been a while since I've looked at that permit, and I would not want to misspeak on the requirements in it, but there are some differences in the approach that is taken and in the background to that permit that I think are notable. It's certainly worth looking at the approach, but it is not exactly the same analogous situation here by any stretch.
And they did do extensive modeling in deciding what the mix of BMPs and infiltration and so on were. And the engineer that we have been consulting with on this effort, Richard Horner, was involved in that, said the model was unnecessarily complicated, and there's maybe 4 people in the state that can make it go, but it does exist, and I think the county had looked at that in developing their model. So we don't want to poo-poo the county's model necessarily, but I think we just haven't seen the demonstration. I also want to note that industrial sites do this kind of modeling for infiltration basin sizing and mix of BMPs and achieve strict compliance with water quality standards consistently. So it's done in those slightly smaller contexts and can be scaled up, I would assume. It just hasn't been done yet in a comprehensive way.
And sort of very subtle nuance to the way the permit approach goes also, and the issue with the model is, again, not having been able to review the model itself during the adoption process for the permit was an issue. But the ultimate decision that was made is that for an EWIMP or an EWMP, that compliance is determined by retention of the 85th percentile storm. And that compliance point was based off of, supposedly, the model. But there was no data to show that the 85th percentile storm itself would, in fact, achieve that result. So, not only is the model not reviewed, but the ultimate compliance point, there was no demonstration that that compliance point would actually achieve water quality standards. So there's sort of a twofold problem with that issue. And that's why we want the determination to be made through a peer-reviewed model that, you can see the results that the public has an opportunity to review, so we can actually figure out, as Daniel pointed out, is the 85th percentile the correct point? Do you need 90th percentile in some regions in order to achieve water quality standards? None of that was actually addressed during the permit process. It was sort of just arbitrarily selected, and no review was made or no discussion of the specifics of that was made during the adoption process.
And could I just sort of tee up my second question? And actually, I'm teeing it up for the regional board. The second bullet there about implementation through an enforcement action, I would assume that your board considered, discussed that before approving the alternative compliance method. So at the end of the day, when you have your rebuttal, I guess, time, if you could please address that.
Yeah, I'd like to second that. When we talk about path to compliance with requirements, this panel has put a proposed path to compliance on the table. We're all looking at it right now. I've seen this path to compliance in other settings. This is the stormwater setting. I'd like some feedback from the regional board on that in terms of staff effort. We heard about the do loop and the review do loop potential. That's a staff-intensive effort. So I'd like some thoughtful response from our regional board on that and other regional boards, as well as the regulated community. Very much so. There's the stigma, quote unquote, of enforcement, but then there's a question of, is this a practical way to get from point A to point B and maintain collaboration? I'd like feedback on that. I don't know the answer to that question. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much.
And since we're making requests, and I see Ms. Bobby Larson in the audience, can I request it at some point? Because I know we've had some discussion, not obviously on the petition, but on this whole issue of enforcement orders and that perspective from the POTWs or from the dischargers community. I'd like to have that officially stated for the record as well. So if Ms. Larson, if you could prepare some thoughts along that line.
Okay. Trying to be unobtrusive.
She was trying to hide there, but I saw her.
All right, next we have Donna Chen from the City of Los Angeles. 5 minutes. Hello.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the board. I'm Donna Chen. I'm here for the City of Los Angeles and our Bureau of Sanitation Assistant Director, Adele Hash Khalil, and our Stormwater Program Manager, Dr. Shram Karagani, who really wish to be here to extend our strong support for the watershed and enhance watershed management plans. Okay, just roll it. Oops. The city has embraced a green-blue strategy through the implementation of multi-benefit projects in integrated watershed-wide approach. This strategy and approach is in line with the city's water quality compliance master plan, our integrated resources plan, and our One Water concept. The flexibility that we are afforded in these enhanced plans is a great thing. It allows us to glean the benefits and meet the challenges of stormwater projects. It allows us to meet water quality requirements in a comprehensive manner. It allows us to leverage resources and support from other permittees, agencies, and environmental groups. It provides a clear approach and guidance, and it provides certainty to meet the objectives of the order. And very importantly, it gives time, the necessary time to garner partners, support, and funding for large-scale multiple benefit water quality compliance projects. An example is our Proposition O large projects, which are happening now 8 years after the measure passed in 2004. So even when we have funding available, it does still take time to design, implement, and construct. The city has embraced the approach and has taken the lead on 3 watersheds. We are working under the permit framework and with numerous agency partners to develop the enhanced watershed management plans and look forward to continue to focus our resources on green projects. And I just want to show a few pictures of some of the projects that we have so far. This is our South Los Angeles wetlands. It's a $26 million project. That's just, the numbers I'm citing is just for construction only, not O&M. And it's a great example of what we can do when we come together. We converted 9 acres of this bus depot in an underserved community in South LA, that's Park Poor, and we built a treatment wetland to capture, treat, and use stormwater from 40-acre drainage area, and we included a pocket park. Oros Green Street, about $780,000. This is one of our first projects where we constructed stormwater gardens, grassy swales, and underground infiltration galleries, and it reflects our city Green Street standard plans. Elmer Green Street, it's about $1.3 million. It's another great example of integrated solutions. Many agencies came together. We have porous pavements, grassy swales. It drains a 40-acre drainage area. And this 28 of the homes in the surrounding area have been converted with low-impact development technologies. Riverdale has planters, porous pavement, and an infiltration gallery along the parkway and side sidewalk. By using green technologies, we improve water quality, increase water supply, and improve the quality of life in the neighborhoods. We also constructed a green parking lot at the Los Angeles Zoo. That was about $14 million. It has permeable pavers and vegetated bioswales. And just an example of some more locations. This is one of our regional projects, again, working together with several partner agencies. That one is about $50 million. We're converting a 40-acre gravel pit to a wetland park to capture, treat, and infiltrate runoff from over 1,000 acres. And we have some other projects underway. This is our Humboldt project. There are many communities that are looking forward to these kinds of projects. And we're always getting requests for more of these projects in their neighborhood. So I appreciate your attention, and we thank the Regional Board for their thoughtful, long process of input, and want to relay our preference to the watershed management plan approach, which empowers us to collaborate and achieve permit objectives.
I have a question. Did you, in choosing these various projects, did you use modeling, or how did you, what was your process for making these choices?
Yeah, practically all of these projects have been modeled. And
what model did you use?
I can't tell you right now.
But
I
let
think
us know later, yeah.
Yeah, there's a number of models out there, and the engineers, try to determine what is the area, what is the ultimate goal that we want to achieve, and there's a lot of factors. Now, I'm not a modeler, but that's my understanding, and a lot of data went into that. And so there are some models that have been calibrated already, and that would save us some time. We can just jump right in and get going.
Yeah, quick question. You mentioned, I think it was $14 million for the zoo project. And just as an illustration, if you know offhand, did you compare that side by side with a more traditional project, in terms of a renovation of the parking lot? Or because a lot of the times, in these discussions, we try to highlight that this is a cost-effective method to do urban renewal when we might have been spending the money anyway, but we just spend it with more multiple benefits. Is there, to take the $14 million project, for instance, are we reaching that point where it's more cost-effective to do this than traditional?
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't answer that question. I think most of the projects that we look at, we try to make it multiple benefit. A lot of other benefits that come back to us. A lot of it is education and infiltration. A lot of things that's really hard to get your hands around. But I can try to get some numbers out from our engineering group and get back to you.
And it was more for illustrative purposes, but I feel that when we got a lot of cost information today in this workshop, yes, public works is expensive, but in a lot of cases, a lot of these projects are already planned, and there's an opportunity to do multiple benefit work, maybe not for significant overall cost. So
Well, we try to do multiple benefits whenever possible because if the community really wants it. They want to provide input. They feel empowered. Some of them are even taking over some of the maintenance on some of the smaller streets that we improve. So it helps everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. All right, Tracy Egoscu and Gary Hildebrand for the County of Los Angeles and Los Angeles County Flood Control District.
Good afternoon, Chair Marcus, fellow members of the board. My name is Tracy Egoscu. I'm here representing the County of Los Angeles and the County Flood Control District. Here with me today is also Gary Hildebrand. He's an Assistant Deputy Director at the County Department of Public Works. Gary also represents Los Angeles County and the Flood Control District. The question posed by your workshop notice and before you today is whether the 2012 Los Angeles Municipal Stormwater Permit contains an appropriate receiving water limitations compliance approach. The LAMS4 permit is not only appropriate and legal, but one may argue that it is actually critically important for our region. On September 18th of this year, the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences, at the University of Colorado Boulder released a study that found 1 in 10 watersheds throughout the United States were stressed. The demand for water outpaces natural supply. As you can see from the map on your slide, Southern California is home to these stressed watersheds. And in fact, I'm going to quote from the study. It specifically found that, quote, in Southern California, thirsty cities are the greatest stress on the surface water system. Additionally, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recently released a report expressing confidence that human activities and global warming cause extreme weather patterns and stress water supplies. As the study predicts, global warming will cause the sea levels to rise, and as part of our nation has already experienced, dramatic weather events. Additionally, other studies have predicted that climate change, as I said, will impact water supply, including in California. The good news is that the Enhanced Watershed Management Program and the Watershed Management Program working together in the LAMS4 permit have sparked a region-wide planning process that seemingly predicted these studies. As Gary Hildebrand will detail, and I am giving most of the time to him today, an unprecedented effort is currently underway in the Los Angeles region in response to the MS4 permit. And because of the compliance certainty that the receiving water limitations approach provides. As our comment letter details, and I'm not going to spend our extremely valuable FaceTime with you today reading from it, but I will note that the DC permit is quoted and attached.
Oh, thanks.
The receiving water limitations compliance is a legal and appropriate mechanism to address water quality issues. It's a mechanism that the regional board and the state board has the flexibility and the authority provided by the Act to use. This mechanism will address water quality issues, and it will also prepare our communities for an uncertain future where water will become even more scarce and even more valuable than it is today. And before I hand it off to Gary, I just wanted to say really quickly that the Philadelphia example brought up by the chair was actually part of the record, and it will be in the record that was submitted to you. The regional board actually considered it, and I'm not going to take the time to quote it to you, but in particular, it requires a retention and infiltration of 85% of the stormwater runoff, the combined. And it also goes into great detail in the actual order, which again I can quote because I brought it up on my handy iPad, about how models have to be developed and brought forward and reviewed, including monitoring plans that will be developed after the order was signed. Gary?
Okay, thank you, Tracy. Good afternoon, Chair Marcus, members of the board. My name is Gary Hildebrand, and as Tracy mentioned, the LA permit has sparked region-wide action. Of the 86 permittees that are covered by the permit, 85 have chosen to take either a watershed management approach or enhanced program approach to develop their stormwater programs. This clearly demonstrates that these programs are a viable way to address the receiving water issues in the LA region. The map before you shows the 18 watershed groups that have formed to develop enhanced programs or watershed programs collaboratively under the permit. This table here details the individual groups and the particular cities that are included in each one of these groups. What I'd like to do is point out a few particular details of importance on this chart. First off, if you take a look at the cities that are listed in blue under each watershed, these are the cities that provide the overall coordination effort in these watersheds. And you'll see, in addition to just the county and the city of LA, you also have various other permittees such as Huntington Park, Signal Hill, Sierra Madre, and Laverne. So this is truly a cross-cutting collaborative effort involving many of the cities directly in this process. Another indication of success is the participation of non-permittees in the program. If you notice, the city of Long Beach is included on this chart. They are not a permittee to the LA County MS4 permit, but they have decided on their own to join 3 of the watershed groups. They're actually the coordinator for one of the groups. That must say something about the benefit of this process. Lastly, other non-permittees are looking at this permit. Caltrans also has been talking with us and is interested in participating in many of the groups. Lastly, I want to address Vice Chair Spivey Weber's question about other stakeholders in the watershed, particularly some of the water agencies. And I'd like to use